Good afternoon, and welcome to all of you to this second workshop on the amendment of the CACM guideline. My name is Christophe Janscreux. I'm the head of the electricity department. Just to remind you that, again, this is the second workshop. We had first one this morning about the MCO governance and task. And this one is about the capacity calculation and the bidding zone review. The purpose of this workshop is to introduce you the content of the proposed amendment to the CACM guideline. As you know, there is an ongoing public consultation which was launched 1 month ago and which will last until the 10th of June. So a short reminder of where we stand in the process. As you may know, we received a request from the European Commission early this year to issue a recommendation on the amendment of the CACM guideline. So after an initial scoping phase, we started the drafting phase together with NRAs, and we launched this public consultation. So we are in the middle of this public consultation, and you are warmly welcome to submit all your comment suggestion to this public consultation document. We will try today to answer as many questions as we can, but again, I invite you to raise all your comments in the public consultation. The next step after this public consultation will be to finalize our proposal and to submit it to the European Commission toward the end of this year. So we can expect that in 2022, the European Commission will take over and will launch most likely the process with member states to amend these guidelines. Regarding the agenda, so we'll start with an introduction from Mathieu Franzen on an introduction to the CACM amendments, and then there will be a presentation from Marco Pasqua di Bisceglie from ARERA on the capacity calculation. Then another presentation from Martin Pauw on the amendment to the system operation guidelines, as you know, there are some overlaps between the CACM guidelines and the system operation ones. So he will address this issue, and we'll have a last presentation from Rafael Moraes Garcia from ACER on the bidding zone review process. In terms of, if you could move to the next slide, Mathieu. Yes, the housekeeping rules. So I would like to invite you to keep your micro muted and your camera off throughout the workshop. You are invited to post your question via the chat, and you will have the full overview of all the questions. We will go through all the presentation, and then we will have a dedicated Q&A session, 25 minutes, 30 minutes max, to go through all the questions raised during the workshop. So again, I invite you to raise your question in the chat. The slide pack will be shared with you after the workshop. And just an information that we will record this workshop, it will also be available on our website. So I will hand over now to Mathieu to introduce the CACM amendment. Mathieu.
Thank you, Christophe. And indeed, welcome all to this second workshop today on the CACM amendment process for the public consultation. As a starting point, I need to make some room here. As a starting point, I would like to say something about the legal background of this consultation. It is clearly based in Article 60 of the electricity regulation, where indeed there's a empowerment of the Commission to make amendments to network codes, but also a role for ACER to propose them in accordance with paragraphs 2 and 3. These paragraphs state that ACER may make those reasoned proposals and should make to the Commission for amending these network codes, but also needs to explain when making those recommendations how they contribute to market integration, non-discrimination, effective competition, and efficient functioning of the market. Pursuant to Article 63, we would also need to consult all stakeholders in accordance with Article 14, which explicitly states that we need to extensively consult stakeholders at an early stage, referring to all the different groups of stakeholders we could think of. So this public consultation is really clearly performed with the objective to provide those input to this recommendation on recent amendments in accordance with Article 63 and Article 2C of the ACER regulation, as it was requested by the European Commission. So then on the public consultation itself, I would say a bit on the structure we've taken. So indeed in the previous, I need to mute a bit, just a moment, sorry. In the public consultation itself, so we drafted in the first quarter of this year the draft amendments, and the approach we've taken is really to allow you to read those amendments and provide your opinion on them, and whether you conclude or agree with whether they contribute indeed to meeting those objectives or not. This is indeed quite extensive, but it also allows you to really give your opinion on proposals explicitly per article. Then there's an optional input where it allows stakeholders to provide additional considerations on the reasoning, but also additional proposals for amendments, including the reasoning. We hope that this approach allows stakeholders to provide their position on all amendments, but in a more closed manner, so it makes it easier for us to process them, but at the same time allowing more to stakeholders to make more detailed suggestions, as also remarked to by Christophe before. In the proposal of the new CACM regulation, we've also looked at the structure of the whole document. Now clearly proposing a structure along the process, so starting with the organization, then capacity calculation, market coupling, bidding zone review, reporting and final provisions, and a separate part on the system operation guideline changes, which result from the review of the CACM regulations and which will also be addressed today. So in this workshop, we'll focus on Title 3 on capacity calculation, on Title 5 on the bidding zone review process, and on this separate part on system operation guideline changes. That would be it from my side. I think we already gained some time, which is, I think, good in view of the debate. So I would then pass on the floor to Marco from on capacity calculation.
Okay, thank you, Mathieu. I will provide you with a glimpse on the changes related to capacity calculation. So we can move on to the next slides quickly. This is the current status of capacity calculation. We have two CCRs implementing flow-based approach, Core and Nordic. Similar approach, few differences, so we can foresee that there is a good level of harmonization already achieved by the mean of CACM 1.0, so the current regulation. We have CNTC approach with different solutions. For Italy North, there is a full coordination on all borders, and this region is sooner as the target to implement a flow-based and to be merged probably in core according to the current regulation. And then we have 5 regions, SWE, Greece, Italy, SCEE, ANSA, and Baltic, with mainly a radar approach, with a few levels of coordination across the different borders, or different level of coordination across the different borders. In this case, the harmonization is still a question mark. So starting from this point, we can move to the next slide, please. Okay. we have to check what are the main issues that shall be dealt with by improving the CACM regulation. First of all, promote efficiency in managing the ACVDC. The experience gained in the current in the implementation of the current CACM has been showing for years that HVDC across synchronous areas, for example, across continental Europe and Nordic synchronous areas, or within the same synchronous areas, for example, between Italy and Greece, needs to be addressed in a proper manner in order to avoid that the capacity on these elements is limited by forecasted congestion that may not be turned to be real and effective in the real time. This is one point. The second point is promote efficiency in CCM. There are a number of issues that shall be dealt with in order to have a capacity calculation as efficient as possible, in order to avoid limiting the elements, or to avoid limiting the cross-border capacity on one side, and to help improving the 70% requirement, to implementing a 70% requirement on the other side. Another key aspect is the harmonization of capacity calculation. This is especially true for CNTC approach, where there are a number of different situations, but harmonization shall also take into account the specificities that are present at regional level. So there is the need to look at the harmonization, but also to keep the specificities. The harmonization was already a target included in CACM 1.0, but couldn't be achieved because of delays in the implementation. The new CACM aims to set up a more feasible and reasonable deadline for the harmonization. Then we have two main objectives, two main targets that are relevant and are related to the clean energy package. The role of regional coordination center that encompasses the role of regional security coordinator pursuant to SOGL and coordinated capacity calculator pursuant to CACM, and implement clean energy package provisions, in particular with relation to the 70% derogation and lack of remedial actions. So we can now move on to the next slide. Yes. That is the first point, CCR revision. As you can see in the bottom left of each of these slides, there are some colors that are matches with the objective in the slide before. So for the CCR revision, the scope is to manage HVDC, yellow, and to improve the capacity, the efficiency, orange, of the capacity calculation. What is the point there? Is that if you have a DC cable connecting two CCRs, independent that these CCRs are within the same synchronous areas or in different synchronous areas, the fact is the same, the DC cable will be included in both CCRs, so will be included in CCR A and in CCR B. TSOs managing this DC cable belonging to in CCRB, so on the extreme of the cable, on the terminal of the cable in CCRB, may or not join CCRA and vice versa. The fact that they may or not join will depend on the outcome of a public consultation. I can only mention now that if we look at merely at the administrative situations, the TSO and CCRB shouldn't join this CCRA, because the DC cable is already represented by the TSOs on the extreme in CCRA. But the administrative situation is only one part of the puzzle, one piece of the puzzle, and we need to look at the overall general situations. This modification, this change has a strong impact on ANSA and Greece, Italy, and Southeast CCR. For ANSA CCR, this would mean that probably ANSA CCR will no longer be there, will be deleted. This is and substituted and with the DC cable belonging to ANSA region, included both in Nordic and in core region. This means, for example, that German TSOs may or not join Nordic and Sweden TSOs, for example, may or not join core. For the administrative purpose, the best solution would be not joining, but this will be decided in the forthcoming discussions. For Greece and Southeast, the main problem is related to the DC cable between Italy and Greece, that now is full part of Greece CCR, but they can be included also in Southeast CCR, and the capacity on this cable allocated as enhanced by the means of advanced hybrid coupling. Advanced hybrid coupling is a way to deal with capacity calculation, having in mind the limitation, the constraints in the flow-based and the constraints on the DC cable. Next slide, please. The idea for capacity calculation is to review also the criteria to allow CNTC. Now CNTC can be allowed only in radial configurations where the flows on a specific border are not influenced by flows on the other border within the same region or within the other regions. This is a review of the current criteria that gave the TSO the possibility to keep CNTC if CNTC is deemed more efficient. Now the CNTC can be kept only if there is a radial configuration with this very low interdependence of the flows. This means, for example, that Italy North, that as the Italy North, the flow-based target is confirmed. SCE, the flow-based target is confirmed as well. Probably Greece, Italy, and SWE may keep CNTC according to this criteria. Other points, third country flows. Third country flows are not directly included in any of the amendments of the proposed in the public consultation, but the writers, the drafters of these amendments have clearly in mind that the third country flows is a key issue to be dealt with in the future. There is a letter from European Commission dated 16th of July 2019 allowing for the third country flows to be taken into account within the 70%, subject to an agreement among the TSOs approved by the competent EU NRAs. This fact is a political discussion, so the idea is to suggest a European Commission to have a look at this in the comitology process that will lead to the approval of the new regulation. We can move to the next slide. Okay. So we have to next slide now. This is a key point to be considered. So allocation constraints. Allocation constraints are allowed by the current CACM in case to deal with constraints that are not manageable as maximum flows on critical network elements or to need to increase economic surplus. This formulation is kept in the new CACM, but is strengthened. Allocation constraint shall be accompanied by a cost-benefit analysis, demonstrating that adopting these constraints is the most efficient way to cope with this type of constraints. So there are no other efficient solution to keep with this issue. And allocation constraints are temporarily limited, means that the CBA, the cost-benefit analysis, should be run every 3 years. And if the efficiency is demonstrated, allocation constraints can be kept. If efficiency is no longer demonstrated, allocation constraints shall be phased out. So this is the strength of the allocation constraint. And for this reason, allocation constraints are dedicated a specific article. Next slides. Computation process. This is another key point, and that needs to be changed for the harmonization, but also for the implementation of a 70% provision according to clean energy package. There are 2 options on the table. Option 1 foresees to implement a flow-based, compulsory flow-based alignment with current Nordic methodologies, with the CNTC methodology mimicking to the maximum extent the flow-based approach and allowing only to compute a CNTC for border instead that a minimum ramp for each element, This means that also for CNTC, there is a sort of copy-paste of a number of steps from the flow-based. This option is naturally coupled with the option aimed to compute flow reliability margin on each network element, also in CNTC approach. The main points, the main scope of this option are to align 70% monitoring that is mainly based on flow-based PTDF, RAM, and margin, and that with the CNTC approach, now the ACER recommendation foresee the simplified approach. The idea is that with this copy-pasting of flow-based into CNTC to align the monitoring of 70% towards a strong harmonization. But this option has a strong impact on TSOs that need for them to change, even in a very significant manner, the CNTC methodologies. On the other side, there is the option 2 that aims to include in CACM regulation only general criteria, more or less similar to the ones already included in the current version of the regulation. This leads to less harmonization. So the harmonization is postponed because it's not avoided, but is postponed because obviously there is the provision to develop for the TSOs an harmonized flow-based and an harmonized CNTC proposal in 2025. So the harmonization is no longer achieved by the means of specific steps detailed in the regulation, but by the means of a specific proposal to be developed by the TSO and subject to extra approval in the end. So we will have with option 2 less harmonization at the beginning, postponed to 2025, and even some differences in monitoring 20%. But this methodology has for sure less administrative burdens at this stage, and take into account that administrative burden at this stage may be in conflict with the timely implementation of the capacity calculation that is ongoing in most of the regions. So option 2 has some disadvantages in terms of less harmonization, some advantages in terms of administrative burdens. Option 2 is naturally coupled with the FRM option that limits the computation of the FRM only to the flow-based and allow for the computation of single TRM for each board in a CNTC. Last point, please. Last slide for my bank. Yeah. We have steps for capacity calculation and validation. We have, these are the steps, mainly derived from the changes included in capacity calculation by the Clean Energy Package, Electricity Regulation 943. The SEC will be responsible to the initial calculation based on common grade model. Then the SEC will be responsible to check whether the level of capacity coherent with the action plan or the 70% requirement is ensured granted by an insufficient level of remedial actions. If there are enough remedial action, this capacity can be confirmed. This is called coordinated validation done by SEC, and the relevant provision is Article 16.3 of Electricity Regulation. If there is not, if the level of remediation is not enough, the SEC may, but in this case probably shall, apply a coordinated reduction of cross-zonal capacity to take into account, to make the level of capacity coherent with the remedial action that are available. The capacity coordinatedly validated by the SEC is given to each TSO, and the TSO shall validate this capacity according to the validation criteria set in the capacity calculation methodologies. This is individual validation, and in this validation, the TSOs usually ask for a reduction of capacity because of operational security issues that were not taken into account properly in the capacity calculation because they occurred after they occur after the capacity calculation or started, or because of flags and bugs in the common grid model. Then the capacity validated by the TSOs, so the minimum value, is passed to the market for the day ahead and intraday market. This communication is done by the RCC. So we can see there in this slide both the new role of the RCC that encompasses the role of coordinated capacity calculator plus the yellow section with the Article 16.3 and the individual and the new steps according to the clean energy package. This is the last slide for me. I will pass to Martin Pov from ACER that will provide you some glimpse about the SGL impact changes.
Yes, thank you, Marco, and thank you for keeping the time. Indeed, passing the floor to Martin.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Martin Pov, I come from ACER. If we can go to the first slide. So I will present the amendments to the CACM regulation and to the ACER regulation regarding generation and load data provision, then on the CGM, and finally on the redispatching and countertrading. First, I will explain what we actually propose in terms of amendments, and in the last slide, I will present some rationale why we propose those changes. So the first topic I would present is the amendments regarding generation and load data provision. So we have this, we propose to remove the whole article on generation and load data provision from CACM regulation and complement ACER regulation to add equivalent requirements. What this means concretely is that we propose that Article 40 of the ACER regulation, which provides some requirements about data provision and data exchange. The title is actually called Key Organizational Requirements, Roles and Responsibilities in relation to data exchange. So what we propose is to move all the relevant provisions from CACM and include it in Article 40. But when we compare the two regulations, we see that not much change is needed to Article 40. So Article 40, in our view, already provides sufficient requirements for TSOs to request data from grid users. And with regard to CACM regulation, these are the data needed to establish CGM for capacity calculation. So the key data requirements are already there. What we did is just provide some clarification, for example, regarding D-2 generation and load schedules. So we are a bit more explicit in Article 40 that this data is also included in this core methodology. I think it's core in this case means key organizational requirements, roles and responsibilities. So we added a bit more, just a bit more substance to this article, but we think that the key elements that TSOs need for regarding information for CGM are already there in Article 40. So this Article 40 doesn't require so much change. The same thing for Article 46 and 53, which are going into the details of this core methodology. We only provide slight clarifications, which are not necessarily coming from CACM amendment, but just to ensure that this article is, the Article 40, 46, and 53 are coherent, they work together well. And we explicitly add the D-2 timeframes. So the intraday timeframes were covered before, but we add D-2 timeframe for the day-ahead capacity calculation. With these amendments, we hope that we don't lose any substance from CACM, but we aim to achieve that all the data requirements regarding CGM are in the same methodology, the same articles under system operation guideline. That's about the data provision. If we go to the next slide. Now we go to the CGM. So the data provision are there to support the creation of CGM. Here we we propose a similar approach. So the CGM provisions in Articles 16, 17, 18, 19, and 28, we propose to remove it from the CACM regulation and move the relevant content to ESER regulation. Namely, we move the relevant content to Articles 64, 67, and 70 of the ESER regulation. I think even before the CACM amendment, this CACM amendment, we have discussed with TSOs and NRAs the need to merge all three methodologies for CGM, namely the CACM, FCA, and system operation. So to merge all these three methodologies into one single methodology. So this work was scheduled in the future, but it hasn't happened yet because we are still waiting for the CGM methodology to be implemented first, and then we plan to amend it to merge them. But now, since we are amending CACM now, I think that the opportunity comes that we implement this merge in a legal way, so that we remove it from CACM and FCA and move all the CGM requirements in the system operation guideline. So in this respect, Article 64, we propose Article 64, which already covers CGM for ESER regulation. We enlarge this methodology to cover both system operation as well as CACM and FCA requirements regarding CGM. So this means that we included the missing provisions of CACM and FCA into Article 64, and most notably, these are the provisions for day-ahead D-2 CGM or day-ahead CGM used for day-ahead capacity calculation. So again, not everything needed to be copied from CACM, only few elements which were not already in the system operation guideline needed to be added additionally to Article 64. And similarly to Article 67 and 70 of the ESER regulation, these articles cover long-term CGM and day-ahead intraday CGMs. We try to improve a bit the readability of these articles by moving the common provisions of these two articles in Article 64. And we added D-2 timeframe and capacity calculation purpose to Article 67 and 70. What is important to note that we include already the long-term CGM in ESER regulation, even though we don't amend the FCA regulation today. But what does this mean? That when we amend FCA regulation in a couple of years, we will not have to amend the ESER regulation again. So we make the ESER regulation covering FCA, CACM, and system operation regarding CGM, so that when FCA amendment comes on the line, we don't need to change the ESER regulation again. Hopefully, we may miss something, but hopefully that's the plan to make one single methodology under system operation regulation covering all CGM provisions. And here we have one dilemma regarding the best forecast of remedial actions. So here we propose two possible options. So first option is a standard option, which means that forecasts of remedial actions are not included in the IGM or CGM, neither for capacity calculation or for the ROSC or the regional operational security coordination. So this option one doesn't introduce any substance change in the CGM process. Option two is a significant change in terms of the approach. And in option two, we propose that IGM for capacity calculation should include the best forecast of remedial actions. And the reason for this change, I will also explain later, is that we think that this forecast of remedial action doesn't induce any costs yet, because the ROSC methodology starts coordination from scratch. But we think that the IGM for capacity calculation and CGM for capacity calculation would be more accurate if the best forecast of remedial actions would be included in the IGM CGM, and thereby the capacity calculation parameters would be less impacted by the minimum RAM margin, 70% margin. There is another change being proposed, which aims to cover the transition period for the ROSC. So Until ROSC is implemented, we propose to adopt the so-called congestion-free or loop flow-free IGM approach, which means that before ROSC is implemented, the IGMs should be aiming to solve all operational security issues individually by TSOs. And when these IGMs are merged, only the residual congestions would have to be solved at the regional level. Of course, this is only during transition period. After ROSC is implemented, no such, we would not allow this forecast to be included in the IGM anymore. Okay, and the next topic is the redispatching and counter-trading. These cover Article 35 and 74. Again, we propose a very simple amendment of the CACM regulation, which is just to remove those two articles. And we move the relevant provisions in the Article 76 of the ESO regulation. So this means that under this change, we would have a generalized coordinated regional operational security analysis with all cross-border relevant network elements and cross-border relevant remedial actions. So redispatching and counter-trading would not be treated specifically in a separate regulation, separate methodology. They would just be part of a wider scope of coordination of all remedial actions and all relevant network elements. Here again, we foresee two options where we still are discussing, and we want your feedback as well. One option is that what is relevant mostly for cost sharing is that only some network elements will be subject to cost sharing. So this option explicitly foresees that some elements are subject to cost sharing and some elements are not subject to cost sharing. And this option also, regarding the concrete solution for cost sharing, doesn't provide any concrete details, but mainly copies the text from Article 1613 and Article 74 of the CACM regulation, whereas the detailed of cost sharing would have to be agreed at the regional level. So that's the essence of option one. Option two is a bit more ambitious in this regard. So it specifies that all network elements, all cross-border relevant network elements and all cross-border relevant remedial actions are in principle subject to cost sharing. So there is no exclusion per se. Then option two tries to clarify all ambiguous provisions of Article 1613 of electricity regulation in order to avoid legal and implementation disputes about this article. We see that in core, for example, this article creates a lot of risks and legal disputes. And with option two, we hope to solve these disputes at the political level rather than at the legal level at the European Court. And this option also attempts to solve, as I said, the legal process through the political process. And in the next slide, just a few high-level reasons why we propose this, one could say, dramatic change, is that in all these three cases, so the GLDP, CGM, and the redispatching counter-trading, we see that the CACM regulation describes the same or part of a larger process that is already defined in the ESO regulation. So ESO regulation defines the same processes, but in a more broader sense. That's why we think that it doesn't make sense to have two regulations and several methodologies describing the same or part of a larger process. So, and also the existing legal requirements in CACM are not inherent in the system, but they result from historical sequential development of the CACM. So first we developed the CACM, we covered part of the problem, then we developed FCA, and then we developed ESO regulation. And with each later regulation, we described the same process, but in a more holistic way. And now that we look in ex post, we think that if we could design alternate regulations again, we could just describe one process in one regulation, and we would do it more consistent. And the risks here is that if we have separate regulations, separate methodologies for a single process, we see a lot of risks for inconsistency between legal provisions and inconsistency between the developed terms and conditions and methodologies. There is also lack of transparency. If different provisions describe the same process, this really reduces the understanding of the process. So there is no clear view. If the ROSC is described in 3 methodologies, there will be a confusion which methodology is more important, and the legal uncertainty. So it's almost impossible to ensure that if there are different methodologies describing the same process, that there will not be any inconsistency, and there will not be any disputes, and there will not be any implementation problems, because different provisions describe the same thing in a different way. So that's why we propose, as we said, GLTPM to merge with core, CGM provisions in CACM to merge with the CGM provisions in S regulation, and redispatching countertrading provisions in CACM to merge them with the ROSC provisions in the S regulation. That's where I want to end this presentation.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you for indeed highlighting this part of the amendments. We will go to the third presentation, which would be Rafa Moraes. Rafa, please, floor is yours.
Yes, hello, good afternoon to everyone. So Matthew, you can possibly go to next slide. So my name is Rafael Muruais from Acer as well. I will start by providing some high-level justification of the changes introduced, and then I will describe those changes briefly. So the main reasoning, so we could say that there are 3 main reasons, but the main one is the need to ensure consistency between Article 14 of the electricity regulation and the CACM formulation when it comes to the relevant bidding zone review articles. In particular, with regard to these 3 aspects that are highlighted there. The first one is, well, the need to add a potential new trigger for the bidding zone review. As you know, normally a trigger of the review is related to, as a starting point, a report from one or several TSOs or a report from ENSOE on structural congestions. The electricity regulation also adds the possibility of triggering a review and possibly a change if the 70% target is not met, or during this period, the linear trajectory, which possibly will not fall on time, but still the 70% target would continue to apply. Then also there are changes related to the alignment of the governance and the decision-making process for the whole bidding zone review. That is more detailed in the electricity regulation. It's possibly not in conflict, but more detailed and specific. Same goes for the timeline for the bidding zone review process related to these different steps. And additionally, the time horizon for the bidding zone review study is set to 3 years in the electricity regulation, while it was a 10 years time horizon in the CACM regulation. We also see this as an opportunity to streamline the criteria used for the bidding zone review study itself without the need for introducing fundamental changes. So the idea would be here just to merge a few criteria or delete very few which did not provide much value to the review. I'll come back later to that. And finally, as an overarching element, the need to enhance transparency and consultation during the bidding zone review. There were some provisions there in CACM, but here from the experience, I think that there was an opportunity to be a bit more specific on minimum consultation and publication requirements. Yeah, so maybe Matthew, the next slide. Yeah. So with regard to the trigger, here, essentially, yeah, well, as I said before, just adding the need to choose between a bidding zone review or an action plan in case of structural congestions are identified. In essence, there is no big change here, except that a bidding zone change would be possibly required if the 70% target is not met. Then there was here some elements of terminology with regard to participating and relevant TSOs, NRAs, and member states. So we tried to keep both the terms of participating TSOs and relevant TSOs. Participating TSOs would be those in the geographical area, meaning the borders, so across the borders or the bidding zone areas that are considered as subject to the study when the review is launched. However, based on the electricity regulation, relevant TSOs should be all within any of the capacity calculation regions of which the bidding zone borders referred to are part of. So it can be a larger scope. The main difference is that the ones above would be those doing perhaps the study in practical terms, but the others would also be part of the decision-making process, starting with the methodology and ending with the final recommendation for member states to decide. Also, well, to clarify that this is the possibility for a national bidding zone review is kept. So essentially, there is no change proposed here. Just as before, the need to show that there is no impact on neighbors and consult the neighbors at some point during the process. Yeah, so maybe we can move to next slide. Yeah, thank you. Well, this is just to reflect how the process at timeline would result. That is essentially mimicking or mirroring what is envisaged in the electricity regulation, starting with TSOs drafting a methodology. Of course, they here could benefit from the recently approved methodology by Acer, and also from experience of when it comes to, for example, national reviews. There would be here a period of 3 months. Then after which NRAs have another 3 months to approve the methodology, or if it is not a national one, but beyond, it could come eventually to Acer in case of disagreement. Then there would be 12 months for TSOs to conduct the study. Here, I would also like to mention that we specifically included some requirements for consultation, at least, so it could be beyond that, but at least on the outcome of TSO's study, and also the need to publish the relevant information. Of course, all confidentiality clauses may apply, but still there would be a need to publish as much as is possible. And then there would be a decision. Well, the decision would lie on member states, for which they have they would have 6 months, or the European Commission in case of disagreement, with the inclusion of a period or a consultation, compulsory consultation during this decision process. If we move to the next slide. So on the criteria itself, well, first, as a general concept, we saw it useful to include the high level, or reflect the high level objectives specifically described in Article 14 of the electricity regulation, namely from Article 14.1 and 3, with regard to, for example, maximizing economic efficiency and cross-zonal capacity, or the creation of, ensure the creation of a reliable market environment, just to mention a few of them that are daring. As I said before, a second element is the alignment of the time horizon of the bidding zone review study, with 3 years for the consideration of network projects as opposed to 10 in the former CACM. And then with regard to criteria, we understand that they are not dramatic changes, but still it seemed useful to streamline them a little bit. So to merge some overlapping criteria based on the experience from recent reviews, and also to remove some aspects that are just mere regulatory requirements that would be compulsory by the time of any next review, and therefore didn't make a lot of sense to keep them. An example of a merger of criteria is, for example, economic efficiency that would be merged with the costs coming from remedial actions, as typically is the effect of the two together, what is under scrutiny rather than them as isolated elements. And an example of deletion is the need for bidding zones to be consistent for all capacity calculation timeframes, as this appears to be a regulatory requirement irrespective of the configuration of bidding zone. So to finalize, just one more slide, and to keep it brief and on time for the discussion and questions. this is another set of articles, some of which actually relate to the Bidinson review, some others not, but well, as it was somewhat relevant for the Bidinson review process, we present it here. So I think it's title 6, which comprises articles 31 to 34. The main changes, at least when it comes to the Bidinson review process, would refer to the ENSOI's technical report on structural congestions. Here we saw it useful to add a flow decomposition analysis aiming to identify those bidding zones that contribute the most to loading those relevant network elements with physical congestions. In our view, this may help to identify those bidding zones that should be subject to study, and which, based on the previous or recent experience, that was some of the blocking, or at least a difficult element to have. So even though this will not definitely tell you exactly what is the optimal or the best, but at least will identify those zones that are contributing to congestions, and therefore providing some hint on where to put the emphasis. Then, as per electricity regulation, the need to assess whether the 70% or in this interim period, the linear trajectory is met, as said, coming from electricity regulation. Then we had as an option on which we are consulting you the possibility to introduce a threshold reference, clarifying that this would be mainly for the purpose of this report, but could constitute a reference on what are the relevant network elements physically congested to look at. So we propose a 2% threshold, meaning that the relevant or the congestions to be incorporated to this report would be those network elements that are congested for at least 2% of the time. The main reason is sort of statistical, in the sense that based on the historical reports of TSOs and the recent structural congestions report, using this threshold would keep essentially 95 of the occurrences of congestions in the analysis. So it's kind of an efficiency. From an efficient point of view, it seems sensible to focus on those that are more relevant while keeping the full picture as much as possible. And then finally, to clarify, because this was possibly a sort of a bit confusion, there is no removal. I think that this was initially considered, but no, it's not the case. So it's just simply a shifting in the concept, but the report of Acer analyzing the efficiency of bidding zones is kept, simply is kept as part of its regular monitoring activities, still with the same period of time as the ENSOI's technical report, but is not removed, just reallocated. That what actually this was the case, as in recent times this analysis was presented as a chapter of the Acer's market monitoring report. So I think that would be the last bit from my part. Thank you.
Christophe, can I give the floor to you?
Thank you. So we will start the Q&A session, and we will start with the question about capacity calculation, and I understand that it's Martin who will handle this part of the Q&A session.
Yes, so I will start the questions and Marco will try to respond to them. Marco, are you ready?
Yes, fine.
Okay, perfect. So the first question is a general one. So will CACM 2.0 also address the coordination of phase shifters?
In principle, yes, depending on what we need. We intend with the coordination of phase shifter, but the phase shifter will be considered as remedial action relevant for capacity calculation. So at least for the day ahead, the intraday purposes, it will be there. Then obviously, phase shifter will be also coordinated by the mean of the ROSC methodology and optimization of remedial action in the coordinated operational security assessment in the day -1 and during day D. But in principle, yes.
Okay, perfect. That was a question from Yannick, by the way. So the second question was from Steve regarding CCR determination. So The question is, can you elaborate why the criteria to determine CCRs combined with advanced hybrid coupling is not sufficient to properly take into account interfaces between CCRs?
No, yeah, this probably there will be a bit of misunderstanding in the idea. The idea is to update the criteria to invent the CCR because the current criteria creates some administrative burdens. For example, giving to the current criteria, we have Nordic, we have core, and we have a CCR answer in the middle. This is the only probably approach that can be followed given the current criteria. The idea is to allow DC cable at VDC to be included in both neighboring CCR. This would mean that the ANSA DC cable can belong to both Nording and core region. So for up to this extent, there would theoretically no compulsory need to include ANSA CCR. So the idea is probably to delete ANSA CCR and to allow this. This would mean that advanced hybrid coupling will be implemented either in Nordic to ensure the competition in access of capacity between the DC cable and the other and the bidding zone net position, and the same in core. But this is not because we don't want, because we don't deem advanced hybrid coupling and the current criteria not enough, but just to simplify the approach.
Yeah, thank you, Marco. And it is good to clarify that we don't specify advanced hybrid coupling explicitly in the CACM 2.0. Instead, what we do is we allow the same interconnectors to be included twice into different CCRs.
Yeah.
So in this respect, I think we have the same goal, but we don't say advanced hybrid coupling in CACM, but we say the same border appears twice in two CCRs.
Yeah. The way to decide, the way to manage is left to the TCO, to the TSOs in the CCM. Yeah.
Yes. I hope this addresses the question from Steve. Then we have a question from Paul. There are two questions actually. So the first question is, does this approach mean that the HANSA CCR will disappear? And second question, would it mean that a single interconnector TSO has to become a member of two CCRs?
For the CCR, this was one of the main targets. So if you allow DC cables to be included in both neighboring CCRs, this means that a CCR made only by DC cable can disappear. This is clear. For the single interconnector, if we look at an interconnector owner managing the interconnector, this interconnector owner, not being a TSO in neither of the sites, shall join to both CCR for sure. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Marco. I think that there were also responses from Soren and Julius. So Soren confirmed that removing HANSA is an option, but not an obligation. And Julius also confirmed that single interconnector TSOs, in case HANSA disappears, the single connector TSOs will have to be in both CCRs. That's indeed the case.
Mm-hmm.
Next question. Yes, next question is from Yannick, also on the CCRs. The question is, if the grid HVDC link becomes a virtual CCR, will ARERA or Terna become the sole decider of the former grid borders?
The current grid CCR encompasses the Italian internal bidding zone borders plus the cable with Greece. So at this stage, both Terna and IPTO are the TSOs relevant, and both ARERA and RAE are the relevant NRAs. If the DC cable belongs to both Greece, Italy, and to both SE, this means that probably IPTO will be no longer part of Greece, Italy, and Eterna will be no longer will not want to be part of SIE. This would mean that ARERA and Terna will be the only manager of the what will be left of the Greece, Italy. Probably yes, but what will be left of the Greece will be Italian internal bidding zone border. So, and then all the transparency toward the market participants will be nonetheless ensured by the fact that the public consultation, English language, and other and so on will be kept for sure, and then will be granted because of by the CACM regulation, because transparency is one of the topic of the target of this regulation.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Marco. Next question also on CCRs comes from Marie. So the third countries are mentioned in the reasoning provided in the consultation. And the question is, what is the process for the revisions of provisions concerning third countries?
Yeah. This depends on the political level, so I don't have an answer now. What we have now is a letter from the European Commission dated 16 July 2019, allowing to keep the third country flows within the 70%. But we really need to understand what are the consequences of this, and this probably will be discussed at the political level in the comitology process when the amendments of CACM will be discussed for the final approval. Yeah.
Maybe, Marco, the question is more related to the amendments of Article 20 when we deleted the provisions on Switzerland and Balkan countries.
Why or when?
Yeah, why? Yeah.
Why? Because the provision on Switzerland, the provision on SRE are no longer relevant, or maybe are no longer relevant. Can create delay in the implementation of the CACM. So the reasons behind is that to keep separated the implementation of the CCR of the CCM on one side, and the legal and a political agreement on the inclusion of third countries in the market on the other side. So just to give an example, Italy no flow based will be implemented independent of the Switzerland joining market coupling, and the same for SE flow based. Then how to keep into account the relationship with third countries is a matter of political agreement.
Okay. Two more questions on CCRs. One from Tore. Will commercial interconnectors be treated the same way as TSO-owned interconnectors in the CCR configuration?
In my view, yes, because they are both, all the interconnectors play the same role for the cross-zonal capacity.
Okay. And there is just one question coming recently, the last one. So the question is, what would be the addition? So the question is from Christian. What would be the additional cost of having to join two CCRs for a TSO operating an interconnector?
It's not a question to be answered by the NRA. I think it's mainly related to the TSOs. I can bet that probably there is the cost of participating in more meetings. There is the cost to manage in two regions instead of one region. So probably not all the TSO will be willing to accept this cost, and not all the NRAs will be willing to recognize this cost to the TSOs. So this is the administrative burden, but how much? Probably it's worth asking the TSOs directly.
Yeah.
We will inquire about that for sure.
Yeah, I would add it. Indeed, we recognize that for some specific interconnectors, removing Hansa will be a bit more administration, but we think that removing Hansa is much less administration for most TSOs. So I think it's a bit of balancing, but I think it's still beneficial to get rid of Hansa and all those methodologies and processes. But indeed, some specific interconnectors might have a bit more work than today. Okay, Marco, on the second section is on the allocation constraints. Also quite some questions. First one coming from Steve. Do you agree the definition of allocation constraint is to be improved to avoid, like, for example, mentioning the constraint on the net position, to avoid misunderstanding regarding ramping constraints, which Steve assumes to be infrastructure design parameter? And then I will also read some comments to that. So Paul agreed that system ramping constraint imposed by Nordic TSOs are not justified. And then Steve responded that his comment on the ramping constraint was to clarify that these are not targeted by CACM. And then Paul again responded, but indeed there is a question on I would summarize the question is allocation constraint only the constraint on export, import, net position, or could it also be a ramping constraint? Could a ramping constraint be a legitimate allocation constraint? This is the essence of the question.
It's key questions, I think. Allocation constraints are for sure a topic that has been raising since the very beginning a number of debates. Allocation constraints are a way to keep into account in the capacity calculation, so in the day-ahead market and the intraday market, but let's focus on the day-ahead at this stage. Some constraints, some operational security issues, mainly related to issues that cannot be translated into current constraints, so into amperes. Means, for example, voltage, means stability, means also other kind of constraints. Ramping constraints is one of these issues. HVDC cannot change dramatically their flows because any dramatic change is limited by the performances of the regulation system of the protection devices of the HVDC. So in real time they need to regulate. So if we don't take into account ramping constraints in the day-ahead market, this means that the exchange program across the HVDC will not be coherent with the real-time performances. So in real-time, TSOs shall apply remedial actions to keep the HVDC exchange program within their performance limit, and this remedial action may turn to be higher with higher cost than the loss of the social welfare due to the ramping constraints in the day ahead. So the efficiency analysis that is included with the allocation constraints, but the ramping constraints is an example. This is applies to all the other constraints. This efficiency analysis aims to look and to compare the loss of social welfare, because with allocation constraints, it's clear that there is a loss of social welfare in the day ahead and intraday markets as well, with the cost of the remedial actions to be used to manage these constraints closer to the real time. So this is the scope of the allocation constraint. This is scope. Will be all the allocation constraints kept? Depending. The idea to include this efficiency analysis aims to keep only the constraints that are really needed by the system and not the constraints that are included by the TSOs to avoid managing these issues in another manner.
Okay, thanks, Marco. I think that our message is also that ramping constraints can be technically justified, but of course this depends on the CBA. So we don't limit allocation constraint only to the net position, but there could be other constraints as well. So then you partly also addressed some of the questions regarding the CBA. So a question from Yannick. So who will define the CBA methodology for the allocation constraints?
The CBA methodology will be initially provided by the TSOs, but the results will be assessed by the NRAs. So if the NRAs are not satisfied with the provisions included in the CBA, they have the right, by the means of a request for amendments, to ask the TSO to rerun the CBA with different assumptions. So in the end, we can say that the CBA the criteria will be in the end defined by the NRAs. That will also be the responsible to assess the results and to assess whether the allocation constraints are demonstrated to be the most efficient solution and then can be kept, or are not demonstrated to be the most efficient solution and then need to be phased out.
Okay, I think you also responded to Torres, so that it's the relevant NRAs who will assess whether CBA is positive or not. Then a question from Ricard. how will such reviews of CBA for critical network elements be made for those elements that are deemed as part of national security legislation preventing these elements and limits linked to them to be shown? I think the issue is about transparency of showing some information regarding critical infrastructure.
I think that this is a critical point that probably should be discussed by Acer and by the NRAs and by the TSOs of these specific countries that are limiting the transparency issues because of national security legislation. And so I would suggest to keep this discussion at that level. I know that it is an issue that we are working on, but we don't have a general solution now. Yeah.
Okay. Then a question from Steve. I think it's a bit unclear question, but I will try to summarize. I think the question is, the core CCM strike a good balance by including a trigger so that it requires CBA only when the allocation constraint is actually limiting the market. And the question is, why has this trigger been removed from the CACM? I think from my side, I would clarify it's not been removed from CACM, but it just wasn't introduced to CACM.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to add something.
Yeah, I would like to clarify a point. Please take into account that current CCM are there, and they are there, and the CCM includes the minimum criteria that the CCM shall address. This doesn't avoid this allows for the CCM to include further provision. For example, this is trigger can be a further provision that can be included in the CCM. What is that this trigger is not made compulsory for all the allocation constraints. What was made compulsory is the efficiency analysis. This I think is a point to be considered. Yeah.
But I think we are open to discuss whether, not to put too much burden on TSOs to analyze something that's never has an impact on the market. So I think we are open to discuss that. Another question from Andre, but I'm not sure I understand the question. So I cannot, maybe, yeah, I don't know.
Still related to a ramping, I think we can skip Martin.
Yeah, I think we can skip it. Yeah. Then the section on capacity calculation process. I think question from Alia. It's a more remark that RCCs are not involved with market participants. This would require significant impact on RCC activities. I think that this was the comment on your slide that RCC has new tasks.
Yeah, think so.
I think we agree that this is a new element for RCCs, but I think it's unavoidable.
Yeah, I think so.
And the question from Steve, in the past 2 years, it was clarified that 70% from clean energy package with the application of minimum RAM, virtual capacity, is valid only for the day-ahead CCM. In CACM 2.0, such requirements are generalized both for day-ahead and intraday CCM. Is it really the intention to introduce 70% requirement also for the intraday timeframe?
This is a long debate, but probably I don't have the question now. Probably will be for sure discussed at a regional level. The 70% theoretically is a minimum level to be applied to all the zonal capacity. So this is mainly a matter of also assessment. For sure, if 70% cannot be granted in the ahead because of whatever reasons, there would be the need for the TSO to start to offer at least 70% in the intraday. But how can be dealt with, or what are the reasons justifying not matching 70% yet in the ahead shall be discussed. So we are in the very first years of implementation of this, and the DNRAs are starting assessing this, and also started monitoring this only some months ago. So it's not an easy question now. So for sure.
Yeah. And the last questions on your part, Marco, I think it's coming from Richard. The question is how it will be measured, monitored, that when a given CCR shifts from one CCM to another, like from the CNTC to flow-based, that there will be no reduction of cross-zonal capacity allocation linked to specific bidding zones or interconnectors compared to what was provided before. For example, requirement to ensure that not only 70% rule, but also historical provision beyond 70% is not reduced when shifting from one CCM type to the other CCM type.
Yes, Martin. Thank you for the question. Thank you for the very interesting point. I don't have personal experience, but I know that in some cases the shift to a flow-based reduce the cost zonal capacity, or in general, not the cost zonal capacity, but reduce the exchanges between one country and other countries because of different constraints taken into account by the flow-based, and because the effective flow-based domain has a different shape with respect to the CNTC domain. This is a real issue, but the loss, the reduction, the decrease of these exchanges are accompanied by, in general, an increase of the overall social welfare allowed by the flow-based environment. So avoiding implementing a flow-based or correcting the flow-based in case to keep the current level of exchanges is justified if the flow-based lead to a reduction of the overall social welfare, but probably the flow-based will, with respect to CNTC, will lead to a redistribution of the overall social welfare and to a slight increase of that, but to a redistribution across different borders in a more efficient manner, in a manner more coherent with the zonal price differentials, with price spread. So yes, so it's more efficient. So I understand that for some countries, the flows and exchange may be lower, but this is due to the fact that the flow-based works in a totally different manner and probably usually more efficient in terms of redistribution of social welfare with respect to CNTC bilaterally computed.
Okay, there is just one short question from Ricard. The question is whether the application of CBA for allocation constraints refers only to loss factor, and I think we can both respond yes, so it applies to all allocation constraints.
Yeah, for sure, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, then we close the questions on this topic and go to the next one.
Yes, next one is me that I will try to moderate and Martin will try to respond. So the question is about SOG HAL. And Martin, there is one question from Steve. Yes, for Steve, on IGM and best focus on remedial action, maybe a one-size-fits-all, so -2 common grading model, -1 intraday common grading is not most efficient. It would make sense to make ROSC and ID compatible by letting ID AGM build upon decision from ROSC.
Just give me a second to comprehend the question. I'm not sure I understand it. Maybe Marco, do you understand it?
Yeah, probably I mean that the idea is to because we look at the remedial action forecast in the SOGL amendments, and they ask is that if why building ID income in individual grid model for intraday capacity calculation based on the day forecast when we have ROSC and CROSA and actually use for CROSA. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I agree. I think that this forecast remedial action is only applicable for the first before the first CROSA. So anyway, after ROSC is implemented, after the results are known, there is no sense of making forecasts in the IGM. Then we have the outcome of the previous CROSA, and this outcome can be used in the next IGM.
Yeah. Thank you, Martin. The second question for Yannick. Would it be wiser to have Countertrading and redispatching removed for SOGL, including CACM, and not because redispatching and training are relevant for capacity calculation and validation?
Yeah, this is an interesting and often posed question. I think there is some rationale with what the question is saying, but I think that what we need to distinguish is that there is the remedial actions in capacity calculation and how they are used is very much different from how they are used in ROSC. And there are two main differences. One difference is that the remedial actions in capacity calculation are mainly used to verify whether there are enough remedial actions to guarantee the offered capacity. So the remedial actions in capacity calculation don't specify which remedial actions exactly will be used, but it just verifies whether all of them are enough to guarantee the capacity. But in ROSC, we start from scratch. So any assumptions on the remedial actions in capacity calculation, they don't have the impact on ROSC, and they don't impose any costs yet, because ROSC starts from 0, and it starts the coordination by assuming no remedial actions before, except for those which TSOs locally have applied. And since ROSC starts from scratch and defines the optimal remedial actions, and the cost only arise from the ROSC, I think that these two processes can remain separate. They serve different purpose, and the outcome is different. And there is no direct impact between the one or the other. That's at least how we understand the process. I think that you could find a TSO or two that could disagree a bit, but I think that we find these two processes different, with different purpose, different outcome. That's why they can be separated. But I think that the ROSC as such, covers operational security, and it's hard to detach remedial actions from operational security and putting it outside of the ESO guideline. That's something that would be tremendous impact.
Yeah. Thank you, Martin. And then we have the final question to you. Some people worries about the fact that the SGL and CACM amendments may not be adopted at the same time. So what will be the measures to have this consistency achieved?
So what we plan is that the CACM regulation, the amended CACM regulation, and the amended ESO regulation will be adopted at the same time. That's what we can be almost certain that this will happen. But then I think we can specify the implementation provisions. So when the CGM methodology, when ROSC methodologies need to be amended, I think that because we delete CACM provisions and we only need to update the ESO regulation methodologies, I think also in the implementation of those provisions, I think we can ensure that it's happening at the same time. I think we don't have this concern that we would have a time gap between the implementation of CACM and SOGL.
Then takes into account that if you can a piece of paper, a piece of the puzzle is that probably the Commission. We expect that the Commission will issue a specific regulation approving a new version of CACM entirely, and at the same time with the same regulation approving the slight amendment to SOGL in the articles that are needed, more or less with the same issue that used for the regulation 280 adopted some weeks ago with the amendments of procedural for the procedures according to the new ESA regulation. Yeah. So the Commission has a certain level of flexibility to do that. So it's not.
Yes, indeed.
Then I'm leaving the floor to Christophe for the moderation of biddings review to wrap up for the answer. Yeah.
Thank you, Marco and Martin. So regarding the bidding zone review, I will start, Rafa, with the first question from Paul, who wonder whether it's not risky to link the bidding zone review trigger to the interpretation of the 70% rule, given that there is no common view on how to assess the 70%. Rafa, we cannot hear you. Rafa?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I was saying that Indeed, that's a good question, though the way I see is that such a risk is not inherent to this process of updating the CACM regulation, is rather inherent to the implementation of the electricity regulation. That is the one that specifies the 70% rule and the link to the bidding zone review. So this is why having a harmonized framework as well, from Acer, we tried as much as we can. And for those in charge of ensuring compliance, being aligned is relevant and important. But I wouldn't see that this as an issue of CACM per se. It's rather an issue of the implementation of the rule.
Okay, thank you, Rafa. And there are two questions, very related question from Yannick and Marie from Eurelectric about whether it's wise to repeat the decision-making process in the CACM 2.0.
I mean, I think that this is an overarching element, and indeed, if this could be a source of confusion, I think that there would be a case to reference as much as possible and only leave the replications when, or the direct sort of copy paste, if I can use it in blunt words, only when this leads to some further qualifications. But indeed, there could indeed be some work to be done there in terms of streamlining, and in general, I would agree. That if to the extent possible, of course.
Okay, thank you. Then there are two questions about the offshore grids. One from Paul again, and who is asking whether the configuration of offshore bidding zones be covered. But I think on this question, I think I can answer that no, it will not be part of this CACM 2.0. But Rafa, feel free to complement if you deem it useful. And the second question from Yannick, and whether the CACM will specify potential compensation for offshore hybrids in case of a change of configuration.
Well, yeah, on the two questions, I mean, on the one you already answered. So I don't think that in principle we intend to have a specific dedicated chapter or reference to offshore winds. Yeah.
No, go ahead.
Sorry. No, I thought you wanted to complement. And the same goes for the issue of compensations. I don't think that this is envisaged as such in any of biddings of the potential bidding zone review process. Rather, what the CACM regulation, as it was before, complemented also, I mean, also in light of electricity regulation, was to put emphasis on the need to analyze carefully the transition, in particular when it comes to certain commitments that market participants have, such as the arrangements in forward markets. So there is a need to handle them with care, to do the transitions in the best possible manner, for example, in light of the experience of what happened with the split of Germany and Austria, where there were some issues in that respect. I think that this is where there is some room to, I wouldn't call compensation, rather ensure that there is no extra costs, hidden costs that pop up. So to do it carefully, but compensations, I wouldn't say, unless there is a specific framework on which I wouldn't be aware of, with some exceptions that would go beyond this case.
Okay, thank you. Then there are two questions about the criteria for the bidding zone review. Paul, forgive me, but I will skip your question about the time horizon, because you were asking whether it would be possible to repair this time horizon. No, this time horizon is defined in the electricity regulation, and we cannot repair this. And then there is a question from Ulrike about RES integration, and she's asking whether the criteria list of Article 33 should also contain the RES integration objective to support the Green Deal.
I would say here that there are different thoughts. First, there are different views as to whether this should be a criteria to be included as the focus of the well, I mean, as the bidding zone review is mostly understood as a tool to deal with congestions rather than to achieve other targets. At the same time, as I said, there are different views, and for example, in the recent methodology approved by Acer. So this was incorporated because the CACM is a minimum list, so potentially it can be included. I think that the point is not that much whether it has to be included, is more how to analyze it. Because once you include it, you need to have a clear thought or a clear direction on how you want to analyze it. And for example, I wouldn't say it's so easy as just saying, well, if there is a change in the res injections due to certain potential curtailments that might occur, which at the current moment is not a frequent practice, rather has to be more on a longer term perspective, for example, with regards to price signals, as mentioned in one example. So potentially yes, but I think the trick is not whether. The main question I would say is not whether, is how.
Okay, thank you. Then we have a question from Christian, whether there will be some trigger for possible bidding zone merger. And I think Paul proposed maybe a solution to include in the technical report a section, a chapter about the absence of structural congestion on existing border, maybe as a potential trigger for a merger.
So our understanding is that the way the electricity regulation is drafted is that the emphasis is on the congestions, the structural congestions, as the main trigger for a review. As such, this seems to put some emphasis indeed on a higher level of granularity, so splits, as of compared to the situation today. But I wouldn't say that this, by definition, excludes absolutely the possibility for a merger. I think that we have seen recently, well, in view of the configurations proposed by Svenska Kraftnät, in this the current bidding zone review, the ongoing process, there were actually one merger or two proposed, also in combination with other reallocation of bidding zones. So it's practically possible. With regard to the type of analysis, I would say that analyzing on a per border basis could not be sufficient and eventually misleading. I think that, for example, a flow decomposition analysis would be better placed, and ideally with a nodal price simulation, but this is possibly difficult to do it on a regular basis. Would better allow to understand what is the scope of areas that are, similar in terms of prices and not causing congestions. But on a per border basis, I would tend to believe that can be misleading, because those regions can be between them sort of in principle not congested, but they could be causing congestions elsewhere. So that's a bit the element. So flow decomposition, yeah, enough. Yeah, sorry.
And I have one last question on the criteria from Edmond from Europex, who consider that there are still many criteria in this article to assess, and there is a need to further consider how to come to a meaningful conclusion, and in particular to balance the monetized and non-monetized criteria.
I think from a personal point of view, I could even agree, but I don't think that more from an institutional. I think that what is difficult is to select those that could be removed, because here there are different sensitivities, and what is less relevant for some stakeholders or institutions is the most relevant for others. So we just, in this case, went for the low-hanging fruit in that respect, for those that removing them would not cause an obvious controversy or issues. Whether there are further ideas to remove or merge, we are happy to hear. We will try to find those that were more like acceptable or likely to be acceptable. And indeed, we would be open, because I think that indeed having a so diverse number of criteria is not so easy. But we always thought that this was somewhat the request of stakeholders at occasions. So yeah, it's a difficult one, but happy to hear views and proposals, and I would say why not to go a little bit further in that direction.
Thank you, Rafa. And three last questions about the technical report and its contents. The first one is from Eric Raku, and he was asking whether ENSOI will be asked to reflect if congestion could be mitigated by molecules. But on this, I think that this is linked to the time horizon. The time horizon is 3 years. So I don't think that within 3 years we can ask ENSOI to consider this the impact of innovative solution. Then a question from Yannick: over which period would we assess the 2% of congestion. Will this allow discarding exceptional events? And last question from Marta, which flows decomposition methodology is to be used?
So on Eric's Raku's question, I think that indeed, I don't think that the technical report as such would be the best place. If any, I would say that why not? If there are technical solutions there that could help to address congestions and are part of a feasible scenario, I think that they could well be part of the bidding zone review process itself. But this is more sort of how the scenarios for the future are built. And in that case, I think there could be a case to incorporate them. But of course, it has to come with some plausible scenario as part of the construction of scenarios. But the technical report is normally more of a historical assessment, so rather than forward-looking. On the 2%, yeah, well, I think that the way of on this one, I have to confess that I would improvise a bit, but we have not discussed exactly how this could be framed. But it seems, in light of the question, it seems sensible to put it over a period of 3 years, because then it also guarantees that it's more meaningful. Because indeed, if you do it per year, it's always you always risk that you overestimate or underestimate those events. And then on the last one from Marta, I would say that normally it should be the flow decomposition method applied for the relevant capacity calculation region as applied in the CCM. Or in the costs redispatch and cost sharing methodology, probably better place there. And in case there would be various CCRs, well, maybe this would have to be discussed and seek some alignment or applied both simultaneously. But normally, I would say that the first principle of aligning with the CCR related methodologies would be enough.
Thank you. Thank you, Rafa. I think I will stop here. Mathieu, do you think that do you think that we have covered at least the majority of the question raised during the chat?
Yes, I think so.
Okay.
Maybe Martin, Marco, I don't know if you've had any sort of last minute ones, but I think we've covered everything.
Okay. Good. I would like to thank all the participants to this 2 webinars, in particular the presenters, so Mathieu, Marco, Martin, and Rafa, and all those who contributed to organize this event, in particular Eni and Pavel. Thank you. Thank you again. I would like to reiterate my message at the beginning that you are kindly invited to send your comments to contribute to the public consultation, and that the deadline is the 10th of June. Thank you again, and I wish you a nice afternoon.